A nurse was hired to take care of a sick child who couldn't speak. But when she discovered the dark secret his parents were hiding, she immediately called the police, risking everything. The day dawned early in the city, with a brightness that contrasted sharply with Sophia's life. At 23, she had grown accustomed to the frenetic, exhausting pace of a routine that left no room for dreams or rest. Since her father's death, she and Elena, her mother, had faced an endless cycle of struggles. Elena, a woman of indomitable spirit but weakened by a chronic illness, represented both the inspiration and the burden that Sophia carried with love. Though the weight of responsibility on her shoulders was immense, her determination remained steadfast. The morning began like any other, with the soft sound of Elena's whispers encouraging her from the room down the hall. Despite her fragility, Sophia's mother held a glimmer in her eyes that instilled hope. "Today will be a good day, Sophie. I know it," she said with a smile that tried to mask her fatigue. Sophia, with a tender gesture, returned the smile before hurrying out to catch the transport that would take her to a job interview that promised more than she could imagine. The job ad was clear. A wealthy family sought a trustworthy nanny to care for their son. The pay was enough to cover Elena's expensive treatments and give Sophia a break from the constant search for part-time jobs. However, as she approached the mansion where the interview would take place, a feeling of unease settled in her chest. The house, imposing and grand, seemed pulled from the pages of a dark fairy tale. The facade was impeccably maintained, yet the silence surrounding it felt almost supernatural. Sophia was greeted by a butler who guided her through a polished marble foyer and hallways, adorned with dark landscape paintings and figures that seemed to watch her from the shadows. She couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. "Mrs. Veronica will see you shortly," the man said in an impersonal tone before disappearing through a side door. The arrival of Veronica, the child's mother, added an even stranger air to the meeting. She was an elegant woman, with dark hair and a pale face, her movements tense and her gaze unable to settle on one point. Veronica extended her hand with a barely perceptible tremor. "Thank you for coming, Sophia," she whispered. The formality of their initial conversation was brief, and when Sophia accepted the job, she couldn't help but notice the look of relief on Veronica's face, as if an invisible weight had been temporarily lifted. Then George, Veronica's husband and the owner of the mansion, appeared. His presence commanded respect and exuded an air of authority that felt suffocating. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit and with a cold gaze, he greeted Sophia with calculated courtesy. "We expect the best from you. Lucas needs someone to keep him calm," he said, his words ringing with a note of warning. Sophia's first encounter with Lucas took place in his room, a bright space yet unusually tidy for a child. Lucas, a 7-year-old with light hair and large, sad eyes, sat in a corner, playing with a pencil that he moved between his fingers as if drawing something invisible. When Sophia introduced herself, he looked up at her with curiosity but remained silent. Veronica, from the doorway, murmured with a hint of bitterness, "Lucas is special. He communicates in his own way." As the day went on, Sophia began to explore the house, becoming familiar with her surroundings. Each room seemed to tell a story of wealth and buried secrets. Family portraits watched her with an intensity that made her feel scrutinized, and the air felt heavy, as if the walls held whispered conversations and unspoken fears. Lucas's early drawings, simple and colorful, made her think that perhaps the boy just needed time and affection. But something in his gaze, a spark of distrust and melancholy, led her to suspect that life in this house was not as it seemed. That night, back in her small apartment, Sophia collapsed onto her bed and picked up her phone to call Elena. Her mother's voice, though weak, had a soothing power. "How was your first day, dear?" she asked with genuine curiosity. Sophia, in a tone lighter than what she felt, replied, "All good, Mom. It's different. I think Lucas is a sweet boy. He just needs someone to listen to him." Elena, always perceptive, noticed the pause in her daughter's voice. "Sophia, if you ever feel it's too much, please promise me you'll leave," she said, her concern masked by the sweetness of her tone. Sophia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I promise, Mom," she responded, although deep down, she already sensed that keeping that promise would not be easy. The first day in the mansion marked the beginning of a story that would test Sophia's courage and her ability to face not only her own fears, but also those of others, like Lucas and Veronica, who desperately needed an escape from the shadows surrounding them. The second day in the mansion began with a sense of unease that Sophia couldn't shake. Upon her arrival, a grey sky covered the place, and the wind rustled the branches of the trees, making the landscape appear even more desolate. Veronica greeted her with a tight smile and nervous gestures, giving her instructions about Lucas's routine. "Today, he'll be in his room most of the day. If he needs anything, he'll ring a bell," she said, her eyes avoiding Sophia's gaze as if fearing what she might see reflected there. The day dragged on slowly. Sophia began to familiarize herself with the mansion's nooks, exploring the rooms while Lucas remained silent, occupied with his drawings. The house, though luxurious, was shrouded in an air of oppression, as if the very structure held secrets it refused to reveal. The hallways were long and cold, adorned with ancient portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, amplifying the feeling that she was being watched. During lunch, Lucas sat across from her. He ate in silence, his eyes glued to his plate, but occasionally lifted his gaze to watch her with a mix of curiosity and fear. Veronica, seated at one end of the table, barely touched her food, merely playing with her fork. George was not in the house, which seemed to grant Veronica a momentary reprieve. However, the tranquility was so fragile that Sophia felt any noise could shatter it. After lunch, Sophia took Lucas to the main living room to play. He, as usual, took his colored pencils and began to draw. At first, Sophia watched as he sketched simple figures, animals, trees, and a few buildings. But as time passed, the colors began to darken and the lines grew more aggressive. One drawing in particular caught Sophia's attention: a tall, dark figure standing in front of a closed door, while a smaller, weaker figure appeared to be trapped behind it. She felt a chill run through her, but she tried to remain calm. "What are you drawing, Lucas?" she asked softly. The boy looked up, and for a moment his eyes seemed to plead for something that words couldn't express. Then he returned his gaze to his drawing without answering. As she gathered the art supplies later, Sophia heard a muffled murmur coming from the hallway. She peeked out and saw Veronica, motionless in front of George's study door, her eyes lost and her hands trembling. The scene lasted only a few seconds before Veronica noticed Sophia's presence and hurried away without saying a word. Sophia's unease deepened. It was not just Lucas's silence or the house's chill. It was the way Veronica moved, like a shadow trapped in a prison of luxury. That afternoon, while Lucas slept in his room, Sophia decided to take a break in the library. The books were old, many on topics of history and art, and their musty smell reminded her of the days when she dreamed of painting and creating without a care. Suddenly, she found a worn children's storybook. Opening it, she saw that the early pages held drawings that resembled Lucas's, elongated shadows and figures peering from the gloom. Sophia quickly closed the book, feeling a knot in her stomach. By evening, George returned to the mansion. His presence instantly changed the atmosphere. The tension became almost palpable. Veronica grew stiffer, and even Lucas, who had been drawing in silence, dropped his pencil and sat still, staring at the door, as if expecting something dreadful. George entered the living room with firm steps, nodded to Sophia in greeting, and approached Veronica to say something, to which she nodded without looking. There was something in his eyes, a mix of control and threat, that made Sophia feel a shiver run down her spine. That night, as she returned home, Sophia felt more uneasy than ever. Her call with Elena was brief, yet warm enough to soothe her. "Is everything okay, my girl?" Elena asked, her voice still laden with love and concern. Sophia took a deep breath and replied, trying to convince herself, "Yes, Mom. It's just a bit different from what I expected, but everything's fine." Elena remained silent for a few seconds before answering. "Sophia, remember that not everything that seems safe is. Take care of yourself, okay?" Her mother's advice echoed in her mind as she tried to sleep. Sophia knew that something was very wrong in that house. Veronica and Lucas were not merely people under a luxurious roof. They were trapped souls, and the shadows surrounding them seemed intent on devouring Sophia's strength as well. But inside her, a spark of determination began to ignite. If she could, she would help them escape the darkness. Dawn brought with it a shroud of mist that enveloped the mansion, making it appear even more isolated from the outside world. Sophia arrived with a heavy heart, the unease of the previous day still fresh in her memory. As she crossed the threshold, Veronica greeted her with a disheveled expression, as if she hadn't slept all night. Without much exchange, she quickly retreated upstairs, leaving Sophia alone with her thoughts and with Lucas, who was watching her from a corner of the living room. The morning routine began as usual, with Lucas sitting by the drawing table. However, this time his movements were slower, his strokes more deliberate. Sophia approached to see what he was drawing. On the page, a hooded figure emerged from the shadows, its dark and menacing silhouette. Lucas looked up, and although his lips remained sealed, his large, bright eyes communicated more than any words could express. It was a silent plea for help. During lunch, Sophia tried to strike up a conversation with Veronica, but her attempts were in vain. The woman, her gaze fixed on her plate, murmured monotonous responses, her voice trembling whenever George was mentioned. The tension in the house was so thick that Sophia felt it hard to breathe. At the same time, her connection with Lucas was deepening. Although the boy remained silent, there were moments when he seemed to find comfort in Sophia's presence, looking at her with a glimmer of hope in his dark eyes. That afternoon, when George left to attend to personal matters, the house fell into an unsettling silence, interrupted only by Veronica's furtive footsteps and the creaking of old wood. Sophia seized the opportunity to spend more time with Lucas. In an attempt to break the ice, she brought him more colored pencils and a new sheet of paper. However, instead of colorful drawings, Lucas began to sketch something that chilled her blood. A closed room with a small figure inside and a shadow projected from the outside. Sophia, still trying to process what she saw, decided to call Elena during a moment of pause. She wanted to share her concerns without alarming her too much. "Mom, Lucas is making strange drawings. There's something about them that makes me feel he's not just an imaginative child," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Eleanor, always perceptive, detected the worry in her daughter's tone. "Sophia, dear, be careful. Don't get involved more than necessary. Remember that your safety comes first," she warned, urgency tinting her words. Sophia nodded, but knew her mother's words would be hard to follow. Shortly after, while putting away Lucas's drawings, Sophia noticed Veronica watching her from the hallway. Her eyes mirrored fear and regret, and for a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something. However, upon noticing George's return through the front door, she hurried away upstairs, taking with her the aura of anguish that seemed to always surround her. As night fell, Sophia returned home with her mind flooded with questions. What did Lucas's drawings represent? Why did Veronica live in a constant state of tension? And more importantly, what role did George play in all this? As she lay down in bed, her mother's advice resonated in her mind, but something inside her told her that walking away was no longer an option. Lucas needed more than a caretaker. He needed someone willing to decipher the shadows that surrounded him and confront what they concealed. Sleep that night was fragmented, interrupted by visions of dark drawings and the figure of Lucas silently pleading for help. Upon waking, Sophia knew that the next day in the mansion would not be the same. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the truth, terrifying as it was, began to emerge from the shadows. The dawn in the mansion was as silent as ever, but Sophia arrived with renewed determination. The unease of the previous days had transformed into a conviction that pushed her to seek answers. Lucas greeted her with his calm gaze, but that morning, something about him seemed more alert, as if he too were waiting for something to change. Sophia spent the day observing every corner of the mansion with heightened attention. During one of her strolls through the garden, she met Andrew, the house gardener. He was an elderly man with rough hands from work and a kind voice that concealed a background of wisdom and discretion. When he saw her with Lucas, he smiled faintly, and after a few minutes of trivial conversation, he began to speak about the family. Lucas used to run around here, laughing and playing like any child, Andrew said, his eyes acquiring a shadow of sadness. But everything changed after the accident. Noticing Sophia's expression, he continued, lowering his voice. No one knows exactly what happened, but since then, the boy has never been the same, and George, well, he changed too. He became more controlling. Sophia felt her heart race. Andrew was telling her what she had suspected. There was a dark past weighing on the family. As the day progressed, Lucas clung to Sophia more than ever. He followed her every step, as if seeking refuge in her closeness. When he drew, his illustrations seemed to tell a story of their own. That day, he drew a closed door, and beside it, a figure that Sophia identified as George. The lines were thicker and darker, as if the boy were putting into each stroke an emotional weight he could not express in words. In the afternoon, when the house sank into its usual silence, Veronica appeared in the living room. Her face, though pale and worried, showed a spark of interest at seeing Sophia and Lucas together. She approached and, for a brief moment, her trembling voice broke the barrier that always kept her at a distance. "It's good to see you with him, Sophia. You have no idea how much good you do for him," she murmured, looking down. Before Sophia could respond, Veronica quickly withdrew, as if fearing that someone might see her speaking too freely. The sunset brought a chillier air, along with George's arrival. His entrance was like a gust of wind that extinguished any trace of warmth in the house. Sophia watched from the corner of the hallway as Veronica tensed her shoulders upon seeing him, and how George's gaze fell on Lucas with a control masked by a false smile. Hours later, while reviewing Lucas's drawings in her room, Sophia heard a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Andrew, who had taken advantage of dinner time to speak without raising suspicion. "Be careful, Miss Sophia. This house has secrets that have consumed more than one," he warned, his eyes reflecting more than his words revealed. Before leaving, Andrew slipped a small piece of paper into her hand. "If you ever need to get out of here quickly, come to the shed. Not everyone here is as blind as they seem." That night, while Lucas slept, Sophia contemplated the crumpled paper Andrew had given her. It was an address, perhaps a place to seek help or a refuge in case of emergency. Andrew's words, Veronica's evasive glances, and Lucas's dark drawings formed a mosaic of suspicions she could no longer ignore. There were more allies in that mansion than it seemed, and although the fear was real, Sophia was beginning to feel that she was not so alone in her quest for the truth. Back at her home, Sophia called Elena. This time, her voice contained a mixture of concern and determination. "Mom, I think something very dark is happening in that house. I don't know how far this will go, but I feel that Lucas and Veronica are trapped in something that could be very dangerous," she confessed. Eleanor, though frightened, didn't let her voice tremble. "Sophia, promise me you'll be careful. But if you know you can help, don't pull away. There are times in life when courage is the only option." Sophia hung up and looked at the night sky, where the stars barely peeked through the clouds. She knew that the path she had begun to walk was uncertain and dangerous, but in her heart, the spark of bravery ignited by Elena's words, and the loyalty she felt for Lucas burned brighter than ever. The next day arrived with a heavy, cloudy sky, as if nature itself shared the weight of tension hanging over the mansion. Sophia felt more uneasy than ever, but upon entering the house, she noticed a detail that surprised her. Veronica did not greet her as usual. Instead, the atmosphere was imbued with an uncomfortable silence. Lucas, sitting in a corner of the room, looked up at her, and in his eyes, a mix of relief and sadness made her feel that something was about to change. Amid that suffocating atmosphere, the front door opened to allow a determined-looking woman to enter. Her arrival broke the monotony of the house and caught Sophia's attention. It was Carolina, Veronica's sister. Her features resembled those of Veronica, but with a firmness in her gaze that reflected determination. Sophia greeted her politely, and Carolina, after observing her with curiosity, took her by the arm and led her to the garden. "I know who you are and what you're doing here," she began, her voice so low it was barely audible. "Veronica has told me about you, and how Lucas seems to find in you a kind of refuge." Carolina shared what Sophia had already intuited. George exercised absolute control over his family, a control that went beyond the obvious. Veronica lived under constant surveillance, and any attempt to break that dynamic had ended in threats and manipulation. "I've tried to help my sister before, but George has the resources and power to silence anything that opposes him," she said, with a contained frustration that made her voice tremble. "I can't intervene directly, but if you ever decide to do something, count on me." Carolina's words resonated within Sophia as she returned inside the house. For the first time, she felt that she not only had allies, but that there was a path, dangerous as it might be, toward the truth. The afternoon passed with Lucas drawing in silence, and Sophia took every moment to observe Veronica, who, unaware of the conversation in the garden, moved with a mix of caution and resignation. There was a glimmer of anguish in her eyes that she could no longer hide. When George left again that afternoon, Sophia saw her opportunity. She headed to George's study, where the door, usually closed, was ajar. Her heart raced as she pushed the door and stepped into the dim room. Around her, shelves filled with dusty books and neatly organized documents gave the place a meticulous yet threatening appearance. She approached the desk and began to sift through the papers. Among them, she found a folder labeled with Lucas's name. The contents of the file left her paralyzed. It wasn't a list of medical diagnoses or common tests, but reports describing toxic substance levels in Lucas's body, detailing how these substances could weaken a child without killing him immediately. A knot formed in her throat as she understood what it meant. Lucas was not sick. He was being poisoned. The sound of footsteps in the hallway jolted her from her state of shock. She quickly closed the folder and left it in its place before heading to Lucas's room. When she arrived, she found him curled up in bed, his eyes half closed, and an expression of fatigue that she now understood much better. She sat beside him and took his small hand in hers. "You're not alone," she whispered, promising that she would do everything possible to protect him. That night, back in her apartment, Sophia shared her discovery with Eleanor. Her mother's voice trembled with fear and anger as she heard the details. "Sophia, this is very dangerous. You have to go to the police," she insisted. But Sophia knew that any hasty move could endanger Lucas and Veronica. "Mom, I need more evidence. If I act now, George could cover everything up," she replied, her voice firm, but her heart filled with dread. Elena understood her daughter's determination and promised to seek outside help. "We'll do this intelligently, Sophia. But please promise me that you'll take care of yourself," she said, her voice breaking with worry. Sophia, looking out the window of her apartment into the distance, knew that the battle was just beginning and that every step she took had to be calculated. She had unearthed a dangerous secret, and now the lives of Lucas and Veronica depended on what she did next. The air in the mansion grew thicker with each passing day. Sophia no longer saw the house as a mere workplace, but as a labyrinth of dark secrets threatening to envelop her completely. The tension among its inhabitants was so palpable that every creak of the floor and every whisper of the wind felt like warnings of imminent danger. The conversation with Elena the night before continued to resonate in her mind as she watched Lucas, who distractedly played with his pencils, his drawings becoming increasingly dark and disturbing. Sophia decided that she could no longer remain merely an observer. The evidence she had found in George's office indicated that there was no time to waste, but she also knew she needed to act with extreme caution. With the file on Lucas fresh in her memory, she began to plan her next steps. Her first objective was to seek additional information that would corroborate her findings and allow her to build a solid case. That afternoon, while George was out and Veronica rested in her room with the blinds closed, Sophia seized the silence of the house to explore further. She returned to George's office, this time with fine gloves from her purse, knowing she couldn't leave fingerprints. Despite her pounding pulse, she moved the documents with the precision of someone aware that any mistake could cost her dearly. She found medical reports, letters from specialists, and lab tests. Each document painted a darker picture. Lucas had been subjected to a prolonged treatment of substances that intentionally deteriorated his health. While reviewing an older folder, she discovered something even more revealing. A set of letters addressed to George from a doctor whose name was crossed out discussed a safe methodology for keeping a subject in prolonged dependency without the risk of death. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine upon reading those words. There was no doubt. George not only knew what he was doing, but he had planned every detail with cold, methodical precision. The letters were the missing piece she needed to understand the magnitude of the manipulation George exerted over his own family. Suddenly, a noise from footsteps made her freeze. She slammed the folder shut and looked around for a place to hide. The office door was still ajar, and through the crack, she saw Veronica standing in the hallway, looking in the opposite direction. The relief was immediate, but upon seeing Veronica's pallor, she knew something was wrong. She quickly exited the office and approached her. "Veronica, are you okay?" she asked in a low voice, trying not to alert anyone else. The woman turned slowly, and in her eyes was a glimmer of tears held back with great effort. "Sophia, George suspects something. I heard him talking on the phone this morning, saying that someone was snooping around," she whispered, her voice breaking with fear. Sophia felt the ground slip beneath her feet. If George was already suspicious, time was even more limited than she had thought. "We have to do something, Veronica. Not just for Lucas, but for you too. I can't stand by while you're still here," she said, taking Veronica's hands. The woman, trembling, lowered her gaze and nodded. "I don't know how, but I trust you, Sophia. If there's any way out of this, please find it." The silent commitment between the two women marked the beginning of an alliance that would test their resilience. Sophia stepped into the garden to take a breath and calm down. There, she encountered Andrew again, who was watering the flowers with methodical movements and a distant expression. Noticing Sophia's presence, he set the hose down and approached her. "I heard that George is more restless than usual," Andrew commented, glancing around as if expecting someone to be listening. Sophia, surprised by the information, decided to trust him. "Andrew, George is poisoning Lucas. I've verified it," she confessed, feeling a lump in her throat as she said it aloud. Andrew covered his mouth with a hand, his eyes darkening with anger and concern. "I didn't think he would go this far," the gardener whispered, more to himself than to Sophia. Then he looked up, his gaze hardened with resolve. "There's a woman in the city who can help you, a retired journalist, but with enough contacts to move the truth when no one else can. If you decide to approach her, I will support you in whatever it takes." That night, Sophia called Elena to inform her of her plan. "Mom, there's a journalist who can help us bring this to light. I don't want to act without you knowing what I'm about to do," she said, her voice low but firm. Elena, after a moment of silence, spoke in a calmer tone than Sophia had expected. Daughter, you've already done so much. If you believe this is the way to save Lucas and Veronica, then go ahead. Just promise me to be careful, please. The next day, Sophia went to the city on her day off and met Carolina, who agreed to accompany her to see the journalist. The woman, an older figure with grey hair and keen eyes, listened to the story attentively and took the documents Sophia had gathered. This is explosive, but you'll need to move fast. If George finds out this is about to come to light, he won't sit idly by, she warned. On the way back to the mansion, Sophia felt as though every shadow along the path moved, and every noise could be a sign of danger. But she also knew she was closer to the truth than ever, and for the first time, she had a real chance to save Lucas and Veronica. Night fell with a mix of fear and hope, and in the mansion, the tension was palpable in the air, waiting to explode at any moment. The mansion was enveloped in a strange silence, as if every corner knew that a crucial moment was approaching. Sophia moved with caution, ensuring that each step was measured and every action calculated. The previous days had been a blend of discoveries and silent alliances. Veronica and Lucas were no longer just part of her job. They were people who desperately needed her help, and she would not stop until she ensured their safety. Veronica was in Lucas's room, sitting in a chair beside his bed, while the boy drew in silence. Fatigue had erased the few lines of vitality that her face once had, and her hands, resting in her lap, trembled imperceptibly. When Sophia entered, Veronica looked up, and in her eyes was a spark of hope, though still tinged with fear. "I've confirmed everything today. Andrew will help us, and Carolina is on our side. We have a safe place to go, but we need to move quickly, before George realizes what we're planning," Sophia said quietly, glancing down the hallway to ensure no one was nearby. Veronica pressed her lips together and nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and terror. "Sophia, if this fails," she began, but Sophia interrupted her. "It's not going to fail. I promise you," she assured her, even though uncertainty echoed in her chest. Carolina arrived at sunset, ready to play her part in the escape. She brought with her a small suitcase with clothes for Lucas and Veronica, as well as some documents that might be useful if they managed to leave the mansion without problems. The meeting in the library was brief and tense, filled with whispers and nervous glances. Carolina leaned toward Veronica and Sophia, her voice barely a murmur. "Andrew will keep George occupied in the back of the garden. We don't have much time, so when he gives you the signal, we need to move," she explained, her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Elena, from afar, had done everything possible to ensure them a safe place. Through a close friend she had known for years, she secured a house on the outskirts of the city, discreet and well-guarded, where Veronica and Lucas could stay while the case was investigated and to ensure George couldn't reach them. The plan was simple in theory, but the execution was fraught with risks. George was not a man who left loose ends, and his unpredictable temper could lead them to disaster if anything went wrong. The chosen night for the escape arrived faster than anyone would have liked. The mansion, immersed in spectral stillness, seemed to hold its breath along with them. Andrew, with a serious expression and determined look, waited for the perfect moment to distract George. With a simple excuse about a false gas leak in the back of the garden, he led him to inspect the problem, keeping him occupied long enough for Sophia and Veronica to act. "Now," Carolina whispered from the corner of the living room, nodding toward the front door. Veronica, with Lucas gripping her hand, took a deep breath and nodded. Sophia, her heart pounding in her ears, stepped closer to help them exit. They slowly opened the door, careful not to make a sound, and slipped down the hallway toward the exit. However, just as they were a few steps away from the front door, a noise at the top of the stairs made them stop in their tracks. George, somehow alerted that something was amiss, was coming down, his expression dark as a storm. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked in a voice that chilled their blood. Veronica froze, her body trembling as she kept Lucas shielded behind her. Carolina quickly stepped in front of them, feigning surprise. "George, something strange happened in the garden. Come with me." She tried to distract him, but he was not fooled. "Silence, Carolina. I already know what's going on here," he replied, his gaze fixed on Veronica and Sophia. George approached with slow, calculated steps. "Did you really think you could escape me so easily?" he murmured, his tone calmer than Sophia expected, making the moment even more terrifying. He reached for Veronica, raising a hand as if to touch her face, but Sophia stepped in, her heart in her throat and her hands trembling. "I won't let you, George," she said, with a firmness that surprised even herself. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it could crush them. Lucas, who had been hiding behind Veronica, peeked out and watched the scene with terrified eyes. George took a step back, a smile that didn't reach his eyes creeping across his face. "Do you know what you're doing, girl? This is not a game," he hissed. But before he could move, the sound of sirens and flashing red lights illuminated the mansion from outside. The police burst in, alerted by Carolina just moments before the escape began. The officers quickly entered, and George, realizing he was surrounded, tried to regain his composure, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you're doing. This is a misunderstanding," he tried to argue, but the evidence was stacked against him, and the recordings from Veronica, delivered by Carolina to the authorities, sealed his fate. Veronica let out a stifled sob and hugged Lucas tightly, while Sophia felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. George was handcuffed and taken out of the house, his gaze filled with hatred, but unable to do anything to change what had already been decided. The mansion, which had witnessed so much pain and control, finally saw its master fall from grace. Elena, upon learning over the phone that everything had gone as they hoped, wept with relief. Exhausted but satisfied, Sophia embraced Veronica and Lucas, knowing that while the road to healing would be long, they had at least taken the first step toward freedom. The house, now stripped of George's shadow, breathed a new air, one that for the first time in years was not heavy with fear. The echo of the sirens faded, but the tension still hung in the air. The mansion, which just moments ago had been a prison for Veronica and Lucas, had transformed into a scene of liberation and chaos. George, still handcuffed, struggled to maintain his composure as the police searched every corner for evidence. His gaze, once instilling fear, now reflected the impotence of a man who had lost control. Sophia watched from a corner, her breath quickening and her nerves frayed. She had fought for this moment, but the weight of what was happening was just beginning to settle. Veronica, still with her arms around Lucas, sobbed silently. The presence of the officers, while reassuring, brought with it a new reality that she still did not fully comprehend. Memories of years of abuse and manipulation crowded her mind, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the fear she had suppressed for so long. Lucas, for his part, clung to her tightly, not taking his eyes off Sophia, as if seeking confirmation that all this was not a dream. One of the officers, a man with a gentle voice and understanding eyes, approached Veronica. "Ma'am, we're going to take you to a safe place. You are not alone anymore," he said, lightly touching her shoulder. Veronica nodded, unable to speak, and allowed them to guide her and Lucas out of the mansion toward an ambulance waiting at the entrance. Sophia followed closely, keeping her eyes fixed on the front door where George, still struggling, was escorted to a police car. "You don't understand. You're ruining everything," George shouted, his voice broken with rage. But no one was listening anymore. The evidence, the recordings, and the statements Veronica was willing to give ensured that his influence would no longer protect him. Sophia felt a tremor run through her body as she watched the police shove him into the vehicle and slam the door shut. The red and blue lights flashed on the wet pavement, a contrast between the liberation and the ruin unfolding before her. When the police finished securing the mansion, Sophia allowed herself a moment to breathe and look around. The place, with its dark hallways and lavishly decorated rooms, now seemed less threatening, though shadows still stretched like memories of what had happened there. She made her way to the ambulance where Veronica and Lucas were seated. Veronica's expression had changed. Though her eyes still reflected trauma, there was a glimmer of relief that Sophia had not seen before. "Thank you, Sophia," Veronica whispered, her voice broken but sincere. Lucas, who had yet to utter a word, looked at her, and for a moment, a small smile appeared on his face, a sign that hope was beginning to take root. Andrew and Carolina arrived shortly after, both with worried faces, but upon seeing that Veronica and Lucas were safe, their expressions softened. Carolina approached her sister and hugged her tightly. "We did it, Vero. We're here, and we're with you," she said, as Veronica let out another sob. Andrew, standing next to Sophia, nodded in a gesture of respect and gratitude. "You did what no one else dared to do, Sophia. You saved this family," he said, his voice filled with emotion. The night passed in a whirlwind of questions, statements, and police movements. The recordings delivered by Carolina, along with the evidence found in George's office and Veronica's statements, formed a solid case that ensured he would not walk free again anytime soon. The detective in charge approached Sophia in the early hours with an expression that mixed admiration and seriousness. "What you did here was incredibly brave. We've opened a full investigation, and George will face serious charges. This doesn't end here, but we've taken an important step," he said, giving her a pat on the shoulder. Sophia allowed herself a small smile, but emotional exhaustion overwhelmed her. Everything that had happened in the past days, from the moment she found Lucas's unsettling drawings to that night, now piled on her like a wave. She sat on a bench near the mansion's entrance, letting the cool morning air envelop her as she watched the first lights of dawn peek over the horizon. In the distance, the sight of Veronica and Lucas getting into the vehicle that would take them to safety gave her a final glimpse of tranquility before her eyes filled with tears. Not only had she fulfilled her promise, but she had also witnessed the strength and courage that could arise from the darkest places. Veronica had found her voice, and Lucas, although he still had a long way to go, was safe. Elena called shortly after, and as Sophia heard her mother's voice, she felt the weight of the night lift. "Mom, we did it. They're safe," she said, tears spilling uncontrollably. "My brave daughter, I knew you would succeed," Elena replied, her voice filled with pride and relief. Despite the distance, the connection between them was palpable, and in that moment, Sophia knew that all the pain, fear, and uncertainty had been worth it. The road to recovery for Veronica and Lucas would be long and fraught with challenges, but they would no longer be alone. With Carolina, Andrew, and the promise from Sophia and Elena to stand by their side, they would begin to rebuild their lives, far from the shadows that had once kept them prisoners. The mansion, once a symbol of power and fear, would now serve as a reminder of a past that had been conquered by bravery and hope. The morning after the operation to save Veronica and Lucas was a whirlwind of emotions and legal actions. The mansion, which had for years been a symbol of power and oppression, was now under thorough investigation. The echo of the agents' footsteps and the murmur of their conversations filled the hallways that, until recently, had only known silence and fear. Sophia, exhausted but determined, watched as the officers removed boxes of evidence from George's office. Every document and every confiscated item was a piece of a puzzle that was finally coming together. Veronica and Lucas were taken to a hospital for medical and psychological evaluations. The hospital waiting room was a temporary refuge where nerves and hope mingled in uneasy silence. Sophia, accompanied by Carolina and Andrew, awaited news. The three exchanged glances filled with concern, their thoughts orbiting around the same question. How long would it take for the weight of years of abuse to begin to dissipate? A kind-faced doctor appeared in the room, and everyone stood up in unison. Veronica and Lucas are stable. Veronica shows signs of severe stress, but she's a strong woman. Lucas, for his part, will need closer follow-up for the damage he has suffered, but he is out of immediate danger, he explained. The news prompted a collective sigh of relief. Sophia let the tears she had been holding back escape, feeling the tension of the past few days release, if only a little. Meanwhile, George faced his own reality. Locked in a cold cell, his aura of authority and control had vanished. His defiant gaze was now clouded with frustration and impotence. The charges against him were numerous and serious: domestic abuse, poisoning, and child maltreatment, with evidence that left no room for doubt. The recordings from Veronica, coupled with witness statements from people like Andrew and Carolina, made it impossible for his legal team to argue innocence. On the day Veronica made her first formal statement at the police station, the atmosphere was charged with expectation. Dressed simply, reflecting her desire to leave behind the image of the submissive woman George had molded, she entered the room with a trembling but determined step. Sophia, from a small waiting room nearby, could see Veronica taking a deep breath before she began to speak. The officers looked at her with respect and seriousness, aware of the magnitude of what she was sharing. Veronica's voice, although initially shaky, grew stronger as she recounted the years of control and abuse. She described how George had isolated her from her family and friends, how he had made her believe that her silence was the only way to protect Lucas. The details of the poisoning, the accident that had changed Lucas forever, and the fear that had kept her imprisoned all came to light in a testimony that left the room in a deathly silence. The recordings presented as evidence reverberated in the air, every word of George recorded, reaffirming the hell that had been life in the mansion. When the statement concluded, Veronica met Sophia at the exit. The two women looked at each other, and without the need for words, embraced with a strength born of recognition and gratitude. "Thank you for giving me the courage to speak," Veronica murmured, tears filling her eyes. "You and Lucas deserve a new life, far from all of this," Sophia replied, feeling a lump in her throat as she saw the strength beginning to resurface in her friend. The following days were a mix of paperwork and care for Lucas and Veronica. Carolina and Andrew took turns helping Sophia with everything she needed, while Elena, from her home, provided constant emotional support through calls that warmed the lonely nights. Lucas, although still scared and quiet, began to show small signs of recovery. He would sit next to Sophia and take her hand, a simple gesture but full of meaning. Each time he did, Sophia felt that all the effort had been worth it. George's trial was scheduled for weeks later, an event that attracted the attention of the press and the community. The evidence was overwhelming, and George's defense focused on trying to minimize his responsibility, claiming he acted under work pressure and stress. However, the accounts from Veronica, Carolina, and Andrew, along with Sophia's testimony about the man's behavior, shattered any attempts at justification. The recordings played in court were the definitive sentence. George had used fear and manipulation to dominate his family, and Lucas's poisoning was the cruelest proof of his sick power. The verdict came on a cold morning. The courtroom was packed, and Sophia felt a chill as the judge pronounced the words that would seal George's fate: guilty on all counts. A murmur swept through the room as George, with a vacant stare, understood that the life he had known was over. Veronica, sitting next to Carolina, let out a deep sigh, as if she had been holding her breath for years. Sophia looked at Lucas, who was on the other side of the room, and smiled reassuringly at him. For the first time in a long while, she felt they were truly safe. The exit from the courthouse was marked by a mix of emotions. The press tried to capture every expression, every gesture, but Veronica stayed close to Sophia and Carolina, her head held high and her eyes full of resolve. Andrew was waiting at the door with a hug and words of encouragement. "Today is the first day of the rest of your lives. It's time to heal and move forward," he said, his voice sincere. That night, back at home, Sophia received a call from Eleanor. "You did it, my girl. You've shown that courage can change the fate of those who need it most," her mother said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't do it alone, Mom. All of them, including you, were with me every step of the way," Sophia replied, allowing tears of relief to roll down her cheeks. The road to recovery wouldn't be easy, but the first and most important step had already been taken. Veronica and Lucas had escaped the shadow of George, and surrounded by people who loved and supported them, they would begin to build a life where fear would no longer have a place. And Sophia, who had been the catalyst for it all, understood that her purpose in life had changed forever, to be a light in the darkness for those who needed it most. The days that followed George's trial were a marathon of emotions, from deep relief to the uncertainty of what life would be like for Veronica and Lucas in their new reality. In the first weeks after the sentencing, Sophia devoted herself entirely to them, accompanying them to medical appointments, therapy sessions, and helping them establish a routine that felt safe and predictable. Veronica, who had lived for so long under the weight of oppression, showed glimpses of renewed strength, but the path to healing was complex and filled with ups and downs. One of the first things they did was move to a house on the outskirts of the city, a place surrounded by trees and filled with light streaming through the windows, a constant reminder that the darkness was behind them. The house had been recommended by Elena's friend, and from the moment Veronica and Lucas stepped inside, Sophia could see how the tension in both their shoulders began to ease. Lucas looked around with curiosity, and although he still wasn't speaking, his eyes no longer held the same dullness they once did. It seemed the open and vibrant space invited him to explore and rebuild his world. Elena visited often, despite her health condition. Her presence was a balm for both Veronica and Lucas. Elena's soft voice and warm laughter filled the house with a warmth that had been lost over the years. She became a maternal figure for Lucas, telling him stories in the afternoons and singing him songs before bed. Sometimes, while the boy curled up in her lap, she whispered words that only he could hear. And although he didn't respond with words, his expression changed, as if Elena's stories wove a safety net around him. Veronica, for her part, went through intense moments of introspection. There were days when Sophia would find her in the kitchen, staring out the window with a lost look as painful memories flooded her mind. However, in those moments, Carolina, who had taken on an even more active role in her sisters' and nephews' lives, would appear by her side and speak softly, reminding her that she was no longer alone. The sisters began to rebuild their bond, broken by years of manipulation and isolation. Veronica discovered that even though she had spent so much time trapped in George's shadow, she still had the capacity to be a protective mother and a strong woman. Therapy sessions became an important pillar in their recovery. With the support of a therapist specialized in child trauma, Lucas began to show small advances. At first, he communicated only through drawings, but those drawings, which had once been dark and filled with shadows, now included brighter colors and figures that reflected happy moments. One day, while Sophia watched him draw in the living room, she noticed that he had sketched an image of a woman with curly hair, herself, holding the hand of a child. When Lucas noticed her gaze, he offered her a timid smile and an almost inaudible whisper, "Thank you." Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she knelt beside him. It was the first time she had heard his voice since everything began. That small gesture marked a milestone in his recovery, and Sophia knew the boy was starting to leave his fear behind. "You don't have to thank me, Lucas. I will always be here," she said, her voice trembling with emotion as she hugged him. Veronica, watching the scene from the threshold of the door, felt the weight of years of silence and guilt transform into hope. She approached, and for the first time in a long while, joined the embrace, creating a circle of love that the three of them shared. It was a moment that represented the beginning of a new chapter, one in which George's presence would no longer define them. Eleanor, upon hearing about Lucas's improvement, arrived that very afternoon with a box of cookies and a satisfied smile. She sat next to Sophia on the porch while Lucas and Veronica played in the garden. "I knew you would succeed, Sophia. You have a heart as strong as your father's," she said, stroking her daughter's hair. Sophia looked at her and took her hand, noticing the frailty that time and illness had left in her. "Everything I am is thanks to you, Mum. I could never have done this without your support," she replied sincerely. The bond between Sophia and Veronica strengthened over time. They transitioned from caregiver and protected to friends and confidants. Veronica, finding her voice, began to explore activities she once loved but had abandoned due to George's influence. She discovered that she had a talent for gardening and enjoyed reading stories to Lucas before bed. She even began to keep a journal where she recorded her emotions and thoughts as a cathartic exercise to help release memories and build a new identity. Carolina, for her part, was not only an emotional support, but also took care of some pending legal matters. She wanted to ensure that Veronica and Lucas were protected from any possible repercussions from George's family. Her connections and ability to handle difficult situations made the transition more bearable. Although George was serving his sentence, the shadow of his name still loomed large, but Carolina made sure that shadow could not reach them. Lucas continued to progress, step by step. Each day brought a small miracle, a new word, a wider smile, or the confidence to fall asleep without the nightmares that had tormented him. One afternoon, while everyone was gathered in the garden, Sophia watched as Lucas, with his still thin and fragile legs, dared to run after a butterfly. The sound of his laughter, light and genuine, filled the air, and everyone paused to watch him, sharing a moment of pure joy. Elena, sitting in a wicker chair, watched him with tears in her eyes. Sophia approached and kissed her on the cheek. "Mom, look what we've done. Lucas is healing, and Veronica is reclaiming her life," she said, filled with emotion. Eleanor nodded, taking her daughter's hand and squeezing it gently. "And you, Sophia, have found your purpose. Helping others is what you have always done, even when you were a child," she replied, her voice heavy with pride. The house on the outskirts became a home where laughter and hope were a regular occurrence. Veronica, Sophia, and Carolina worked together to maintain stability for Lucas, who was beginning to speak more, though still cautiously. His words always came with a glance toward Sophia or his mother, as if he needed confirmation that everything was okay. And it was. One winter afternoon, as they were preparing dinner, Veronica approached Sophia. "I don't know how I could thank you for everything you've done for us, but I want you to know that you are part of our family, not just in words, but in my heart," she said, her eyes filled with gratitude and sincerity. Sophia looked at her and smiled. "You don't need to thank me, Veronica. What we do for love needs no payment or recognition. We are family, and that's all that matters." In time, Sophia decided to return to her studies and began training in child psychology, inspired by Lucas and the experience that had transformed her. Veronica supported her decision, helping her in any way she could, while Carolina and Elena also encouraged this new path. The house became a place of learning, healing, and love, a testament that even after the darkest moments, light could find its way back. Months turned into a year, and one day, while celebrating Lucas's birthday, Sophia looked around and saw Eleanor, Veronica, Carolina, and Andrew laughing and sharing stories. Lucas, wearing a handmade paper crown, approached her and whispered, "This is the best birthday of my life." Sophia hugged him tightly and, with tears in her eyes, knew that this moment encapsulated everything she had fought for. The road had not been easy, but every effort, every sleepless night, and every tear shed had been worth it. They had formed a new family, one where love, resilience, and hope intertwined. Veronica and Lucas's story was not just one of survival, but of rebirth, and Sophia, who had been their beacon in the storm, felt complete for the first time. The spring air wafted through the open windows of the house on the outskirts, bringing with it the scent of fresh flowers and the sounds of Lucas and Veronica's laughter in the garden. Sophia, standing in the kitchen, watched the scene as she prepared lemonade, her heart filled with a kind of peace that can only be achieved after a devastating storm. The house, which had once been a temporary refuge from fear, had transformed into a home brimming with life and hope. Time had passed, and although the scars of the past remained, the transformation was evident. Lucas was no longer the withdrawn child who viewed the world with fearful eyes. Now, he ran through the garden, his bare feet touching the grass as he laughed and called for his mother to chase him. Veronica, having regained her smile and confidence, chased after him, their laughter filling the air. That image of mother and son sharing a moment of pure joy served as a reminder that love and determination can change everything. Sophia set the tray with lemonade on the terrace table and stepped outside to join them. Lucas, upon seeing her, ran towards her and hugged her tightly. "Sophia, look, I found a blue butterfly, just like the ones I used to draw," he said, his words clear and strong, a sign of how far he had come in his recovery. Veronica approached and hugged both of them, and for a moment, the three souls who had shared so much pain were united in a silent but unbreakable bond. Elena arrived shortly after, walking a bit slower than usual, but with a smile reflecting the satisfaction of seeing her family gathered and happy. Although her illness was progressing slowly, her spirit remained as strong and warm as ever. Lucas ran to her, taking her hand to show her his drawings and tell her the stories he invented. Elena listened attentively, stroking his hair and nodding at every word, her eyes sparkling with pride she could not hide. The afternoons in that house were a mosaic of simple yet meaningful moments. Sophia continued her studies in child psychology, growing increasingly passionate about the idea of helping other children who, like Lucas, had gone through traumatic experiences. Her decision to specialize in child therapy stemmed not only from her love for Lucas, but also from her deep understanding of what it meant to be trapped in a reality of fear and oppression, and to have someone extend a hand to pull you out of it. One day, while studying in the living room, Veronica sat down next to her with a steaming cup of tea. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through, about all you did for us," she began, her voice low but filled with emotion. "I want to do something with this second chance you've given us. I want to help other women who have gone through the same thing. Maybe I can work at a support center, or share my story so others know there is hope," she said, her eyes reflecting a determination not seen in her for a long time. Sophia felt her heart race. "That would be amazing, Veronica. No one better than you to understand what it means to reclaim your voice and your life," she replied, excited. The thought that Veronica, who once feared even the slightest noise in the mansion, was now talking about inspiring and supporting other women was proof of how far they had come. Summer brought long afternoons, with Carolina and Andrew visiting more frequently. Carolina, always with a smile and a sarcastic comment to make everyone laugh, had become a protective aunt to Lucas and a loyal sister to Veronica. Andrew, for his part, helped with the garden and shared stories from the past, some funny, others filled with life lessons. There was something deeply healing in the constant presence of friends and family, and each day seemed a reminder that they were no longer alone. One afternoon, while Lucas was playing with Andrew to build a small wooden house in the garden, a letter arrived that would change the course of their lives. Sophia opened it with trembling hands and read aloud. They had received a grant to open a support center for children and women who had experienced abuse. The idea, which had started as a dream during nighttime conversations with Veronica, was now materializing into reality. The center would be named House of Hope, a place where those who had suffered could find support, understanding, and a new beginning. The news was met with hugs and tears of joy. Veronica, overjoyed, lifted Lucas into her arms and whispered in his ear, "All of this is for you, my love, because you will never again be in the dark." Lucas, with the confidence he had gained over time, kissed his mother's cheek and looked at Sophia with a smile. "You're my family too," he said, and those words etched themselves in Sophia's heart as a reminder that the love she had sown continued to grow and transform. The project for the House of Hope became the purpose of them all. Carolina contributed her legal skills and contacts to ensure everything moved smoothly. Veronica began training as a support counselor, with the help of therapists and professionals who shared her vision. Sophia, nearing the completion of her studies, felt inspired as she saw the house that had once been a temporary refuge transform into a beacon of hope for others. On the day of the center's inauguration, the air was filled with excitement. Friends, neighbors, and people who had heard about Veronica and Lucas's story gathered to support the cause. Eleanor, despite her frailty, attended and was welcomed with applause. Her words during the event resonated with everyone present. Today, we celebrate not just survival, but the courage of those who choose love and hope in the face of adversity. This is a reminder that together, we can face any darkness. When it was Veronica's turn to speak, she took the microphone with trembling hands, but with a firm gaze. For years, I believed my story was destined to be one of fear and submission. But thanks to the help of those who believed in me, I discovered I had the strength to move forward. Today, I promise to dedicate my life to helping others find that same strength, to remind them they are not alone and that there is always a path to the light, she said, tears rolling down her cheeks. Lucas, from his seat, looked at his mother with pride and for the first time in public, stood up and ran to her, hugging her tightly. The applause that followed was deafening, and Sophia, watching the scene, felt the circle close. The little family she had helped save had not only survived, but had thrived. The center became a gathering and healing place, a testament that second chances exist, and that, although pain is part of the journey, overcoming it is possible with love and support. Sophia, Veronica, Lucas, and all those around them formed a team that tirelessly worked to change the narratives of others, to offer the hand that Sophia once extended in the shadows of a mansion full of secrets. At the end of the day, as the sun set and the lights of the center illuminated the night, Sophia sat on the porch of the house with Elena, Veronica, and Lucas. The sky, painted in shades of orange and purple, reflected the beauty of a new beginning. Lucas snuggled into Sophia's lap and, looking at the stars beginning to appear, whispered, "Now the shadows aren't scary anymore." And in that moment, Sophia knew that the struggle had been worth every tear, every sleepless night, and every moment of uncertainty. They had found their way back to the light, and with each passing day, that light grew brighter, reminding them that true victory lies not only in surviving, but in learning to live fully and in helping others to do the same. And so we come to the end of our story of courage, hope, and rebirth. I hope that the journey of Sophia, Veronica, and Lucas has touched your heart as much as it has touched mine. This story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, light can shine again with the help and love of those around us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and transformative stories. Remember, there is always hope, and true strength lies in standing up and helping others to do the same. We'll see you in the next chapter, where we'll continue exploring more stories of overcoming and bravery. Take care and remember, you are not alone. Until next time.